The coat rested on my shoulders like a question I wasn't ready to answer, heavy from rain and memory, the sleeves brushing the sides of my arms as I turned halfway toward him, not sure whether to step closer or let the silence pull me back into myself. But his hands were already moving, slow and intentional, fastening the top button near my throat with a tenderness that felt too personal for this hallway, this moment, this new version of us where nothing was said out loud but everything had weight, and then his fingers paused, not in hesitation, but in reverence. And his voice came low enough that it skimmed the surface of my skin when he said, "You still feel everything, don't you?" And I didn't respond because something inside me, something old and unsteady, was already trembling in a place where no answer would have made it stop. It had been 11 days since the funeral, though I'd stopped counting sometime around the third when casseroles stopped showing up and the house quieted into the kind of stillness that pressed against the windows and made the air feel thick. And it was on that 11th day that Richard arrived at our front door, not unannounced, not exactly invited, just standing there in the late light with 2 suitcases and a face that looked like it had already forgotten how to smile, saying only, "I can't be in that house alone." And Brian nodded, already stepping aside before I even opened my mouth. He moved into the guest room the same evening, placing his shaving kit on the bathroom counter next to mine, folding his sweaters into drawers that had only held spare linens, and even though he said it was just for a while, "Until I find my footing," he'd mumbled over his shoulder, I could already feel the shift, not in furniture or schedule, but in presence, the way a shadow alters the light without changing the room. Brian didn't stay home to ease the transition. He dove back into work the way some people dive into lakes when they don't want to feel their skin anymore, staying late under the pretense of client dinners and market forecasts. And soon the house was mostly Richard and me, floating around, each other like satellites caught in a gravitational pull neither of us asked for. I told myself this wasn't permanent, that this was his father, not mine. That grief had strange ways of showing itself, and hosting was the least we could do. And I held that line between us like a fence, one I reinforced with polite nods and quiet mornings and never letting our conversations stretch past what was necessary. But Richard didn't press, didn't intrude, didn't ask more than the space he'd quietly filled. What unsettled me wasn't his presence. It was his awareness, the way he noticed the exact hour. I stepped onto the back porch with my coffee, always a few minutes before sunrise. My legs pulled up under me as the breeze moved through the railing and the steam rose from my cup like the only thing left I could control, and he wouldn't speak, just sit near the screen door with his own coffee, both of us looking outward, but never at each other. He noticed more than he let on, how I opened all the windows before bed to feel the night air settle over the house, how I stretched developed film across the drying line in the laundry room with hands that shook not from error but from emotion I couldn't explain, how sometimes I stared too long at nothing, blinking like I was trying to clear dust from my mind instead of my eyes, and he didn't comment on any of it, just lingered in the background like someone waiting to be useful. It was a Tuesday, I think, when the pantry hook snapped off in my hand, one of those tiny plastic things that holds a broom or a dustpan, and I muttered something under my breath as I crouched to pick it up, only to hear the slow shuffle of footsteps behind me, and when I turned, Richard was already there, crouching beside me like he'd been waiting for this kind of small emergency, the kind men of his generation always seemed to keep screwdrivers in their pockets for. "Let me," he said gently but firmly, as he reached for the broken piece, in my palm, and our fingers touched. Not clumsily, but deliberately, like a whisper between skin that remembered something it hadn't been told yet. And then he looked up at me, not smiling, just present, and said, "I'm not the man you married, but I used to be someone like him." That night I lay awake longer than usual, listening for sounds I hadn't noticed before. His steady steps toward the kitchen for a glass of water, the faint creak of the guest room door, the way he cleared his throat like someone trying to stay quiet but not invisible. And when morning came, I found myself waiting for the echo of those steps. Not with anticipation, but with the strange comfort that comes from knowing someone else is pacing in the dark, too. He didn't fill the house with conversation the way Brian did when he was in one of his moods, didn't argue over trivial things, like where I kept the mail or why the thermostat needed adjusting. He simply listened, and when I spoke, he gave me space to finish, even if I didn't know what I was saying until it was already out there between us, like something fragile we both wanted to pretend wasn't real. It rained that evening, a slow and steady rhythm that softened the edges of everything, and I stepped outside onto the porch like I always did when I needed the air to carry something away, only to find he'd already placed a blanket on the bench, folded once, not wide enough to avoid sitting close, and I sat without speaking, letting the water hit the roof like a lullaby neither of us believed in anymore. After several long minutes, he said, "It's been quiet too long in this house." And though I didn't answer, I felt his words settle somewhere in my chest like a thread being pulled loose, and I turned my gaze toward the dark trees beyond the yard and exhaled just enough to keep from breaking. The silence after his words wasn't empty. It was dense like wet fabric, stretching across the porch between us and wrapping itself around my shoulders tighter than the blanket we shared, and I didn't look at him, not even from the corner of my eye, because I already knew the expression he wore, the one that held too much understanding to feel like kindness and too little distance to feel like safety. So instead, I focused on the sound of rain hitting the garden pots and the way it trickled from the gutter like a ticking clock we weren't allowed to notice. When I finally stood up to go inside, I didn't thank him for the blanket or the company, just stepped barefoot through the open doorway and into the dim light of the kitchen where his cup still sat near mine, both of them half-finished and cold, and I stared at them longer than I should have, as if two forgotten mugs could tell me how far things had drifted from what they were supposed to be. I told myself the weight I felt was just grief settling into the corners of the house, the way dust does when no one has the energy to wipe it clean. But I knew that wasn't the truth because it didn't feel like dust. It felt like breath. Someone else's breath in rooms I thought belonged to me, in patterns I didn't create, in places I didn't invite it, and no matter how much I tried to fold the guest towels or rearrange the vases or vacuum the hall, I could still feel him in every space. Mornings took on a rhythm that made me both uneasy and oddly alert, like I was moving through choreography someone else had written, and I would sit at the breakfast table with my back to the window, waiting to hear his footsteps descend the stairs, slower than Brian's, measured, with that soft pause before the third one creaked, and I hated that I listened for it, hated more that my body stilled when I heard it, like an instrument tuning itself without permission. He didn't speak unless there was something worth saying, which somehow made his voice more memorable than Brian's endless commentary on the stock market or the parking situation at his office, and when Richard asked how I slept or whether I needed help reaching the back shelf, it felt less like small talk and more like attention, which made it harder to ignore and harder to explain, even to myself. That week passed in fragments, laundry cycles, reheated meals, emails I barely skimmed, until Thursday when I stood in the laundry room again, this time with a new roll of film clipped across the wire near the window. And as I examined the negatives under the dim bulb, I became aware of him behind me, not approaching, not interrupting, just standing with a kind of patience that made me feel watched without being invaded. I didn't turn around, just continued to move, the photos gently along the string, my hands steadier than they had been the week before, and he stayed there until I finished. Until I set down the clothespins and wiped my palms on my jeans like someone finishing a prayer they hadn't meant to say out loud, and when I finally glanced back, he nodded once, a quiet gesture that felt like approval, or recognition, or both. Next day it happened again. That small moment that shouldn't have meant anything but left something behind, and this time it was the pantry. Again, always the pantry, where I stood sorting through the top shelf, balancing on my toes when the flour bag slipped and a storm of white dust covered the counter and my sleeves and my mood. And before I could curse under my breath, he was there, a clean towel already in hand, not laughing, just helping. And as I reached for the other side of the bag, our hands met and I didn't pull mine away fast enough. He didn't either. Our eyes didn't lock. We didn't speak. We just stood there with fingers tangled in the edge of something not quite real and not quite harmless, until I mumbled a half-hearted thank you and turned back toward the sink with a flush in my neck. I hoped he didn't notice, but part of me knew he did. That night, I didn't wait for the rain to start. I just stepped onto the porch again, alone this time. But he joined me within minutes, his footsteps quiet, almost apologetic, as he placed a second mug beside mine and sat down without a word, and together we listened to the breeze gathering in the trees like it was rehearsing a storm that hadn't yet arrived. We didn't touch. We didn't even face each other. But when he finally spoke, it was with the same gravity as before. That same unhurried weight that dropped into the silence like a stone in water. It's been quiet too long in this house, and this time I didn't pretend not to hear. I just let my eyes fall to the grain of the wood beneath my feet and exhaled slowly through my nose, not as agreement, not as resistance, but as something in between. And I stayed there longer than I meant to, letting the quiet stretch until it didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something we were building without meaning to. The film canister slipped from my hand before I even realized I had fumbled it, clattering against the hardwood floor and rolling just far enough to escape the edge of the rug, and I muttered something under my breath as I bent down to reach it. But before my fingers touched the plastic, his hand was already there, steady and deliberate, not rushing but precise, catching the canister between thumb and palm like it was something fragile that deserved gentleness. And when I looked up, he didn't offer it back to me right away, instead turning it over slowly as though reading it like a letter, his eyes lowering to the faint smudges of my fingerprints left across the matte surface. And then he asked in a tone that wasn't curious but almost reverent, "You still shoot with film?" And I said, "Only when I want it to matter." And for a moment the air between us held the weight of things that mattered too much to name. He didn't nod or smile or move to fill the silence, just stood there with the canister in his hand, like he was trying to feel the intention behind it, and something about the way he held it, carefully, deliberately, with fingers that didn't tremble but didn't force, made me feel suddenly more visible than I had in months, maybe even longer, like the act of creating something on film still tethered me to the version of myself I thought had disappeared under layers of house routines and daily noise and quiet compromises that no one ever calls by name. Later that morning, he asked to see my work, not casually, not like someone making small talk or filling time, but like a man who had already decided that what I created said more about me than anything I could explain. And I hesitated not because I didn't want to share it, but because I hadn't shown anyone those prints in a long time, not even Brian, who used to ask and then stopped asking when the months passed, and the dark room light was replaced by hallway lamps and unopened mail. Still, I led Richard down the hall to the room I used to call mine, but now mostly passed without entering, unlocking the drawer and laying the folders out in soft stacks, guiding him without narration through a decade of light and shadow pressed into paper. And he didn't say anything for the first several minutes, just moved slowly from frame to frame like someone walking a path they'd been told not to rush. And when he stopped at the beach photo, one I hadn't looked at in years, I felt my breath catch in my chest because I knew which one it was even before he said, "Your husband looks the same." And then after a pause so long it almost felt like a choice, he added, "You look more alive there." And I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a wound, but it stayed with me all day like a song I didn't ask to remember. That afternoon, he brought me coffee without asking if I wanted any, just set it on the counter, next to me while I loaded dishes into the sink, and I thanked him automatically, lifting the mug to my lips before pausing with the first sip still warming the porcelain, saying, "I don't take sugar, more out of habit than annoyance." And he nodded just once, not defensive, not flustered. And the next day, the coffee came again, and this time it was black, strong, and bitter the way I liked it, and I drank it without comment because the gesture said more than anything I could have replied. By the third day, the rhythm felt familiar, coffee placed before words, glances that lingered just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be named. And when I stepped into the garage that afternoon, I found him bent over the old oak cabinet I'd been meaning to fix for months, sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes narrowed in concentration as he measured the warped panel and muttered something about the grain pulling uneven, and I didn't ask why he'd chosen that project or when he had decided to care about it. I just stood nearby holding a small box of nails that rattled with every shift of my hand. He reached for a nail and our fingers met again, warmer this time, more open, and for a breath too long I didn't move, and neither did he, his thumb brushing lightly across my wrist as though testing the pulse there, and I didn't flinch but I didn't lean in either, suspended in that strange space where touch means nothing and everything, and then he pulled back, not sharply, not in shame, just with that same careful slowness he used for everything, and I stayed still, not following, not retreating, just feeling the air where his skin had been and wishing it hadn't left so soon. That evening, Brian texted to say he'd be late again, a meeting that turned into drinks, maybe dinner depending, on the client's mood, and I didn't ask for details or promise to save him a plate. Just closed the message and sat at the kitchen table, while Richard entered the room holding a folded newspaper under one arm and nodded toward the candles I'd already lit, because the power had flickered earlier, and I didn't trust the silence. Not to deepen, and we sat there, not side by side, but not across from each other either, surrounded by soft shadows that made the room feel smaller and older and somehow more private than any conversation we could have had. When the lights did go out for good, he didn't curse or rush to find a flashlight, just struck a match with the same kind of steady calm he brought to everything, lighting the candle closest to him and setting it between us like a question neither of us wanted to answer. And for a long moment, we didn't speak. Just let the flicker play across our faces and watch the shapes it made on the walls as though they might say something first. Then his voice came, not loud, not uncertain, just honest, as he said, "You remind me of who I was supposed to love," and I didn't know what to do with that sentence, didn't know where to put it or how to carry it, so I just looked at him, holding my breath so tightly I thought my chest might splinter, and I didn't respond, not because I didn't feel something, but because I didn't trust myself to know what it meant. I left the table before he could speak again, climbing the stairs with slow feet and a faster heart, curling under the blanket in our two-big bed with my eyes wide open to the ceiling and my hands clenched around the sheet like it could keep me grounded, and I didn't fall asleep until hours later, when the candle's glow had long faded from my memory and I could almost pretend I hadn't heard what he said. But the next morning, when I reached across the table for the butter dish and my hand grazed his, I noticed he didn't pull away. That moment at the breakfast table unraveled, slower than it should have, not because the touch itself was dramatic or forbidden, but because neither of us moved away the way people are supposed to when something brushes too close by accident, and I kept my eyes on the butter dish as if that made it ordinary, as if pressing the edge of my palm against the warm line of his wasn't enough to start the kind of storm that lives quietly in your chest for days before it dares to speak. He didn't flinch or twitch or do any of the things that might have made it easier to laugh off, and instead, he let our hands rest in parallel contact for just a second longer than anyone would call casual, not pressing, not holding, just not letting go. And then I moved first, slowly, without apology, my fingers curling back around my cup as if they had never forgotten their original task. And we didn't say anything about it, not then, not later, but the silence that followed carried a new tension. Not sharp, but humming just beneath the table where our knees almost touched. I spent most of that day rearranging my studio, not because it needed it, but because I did. Shifting old frames and half-used rolls of film into new corners, trying to force my body into motion so my mind would quiet down. And I kept telling myself there was no meaning in a single touch. Not when the whole house was full of small, practical gestures between us, passing salt, handing over laundry, reaching for the same drawer. But I also knew that none of those other touches had made me lie awake the night before, staring into darkness like it could explain anything. By afternoon, I had filled an entire trash bag with prints I had promised. Myself I'd archive but never would, and I sat cross-legged in the middle of the room, flipping through a pile of rejected shots that felt more personal now than when I'd taken them, when I heard his footsteps pause in the hallway just outside, not entering, not announcing himself, just hovering with the kind of patience that made it clear he wasn't listening but waiting, and I felt the weight of his awareness like light through a cracked door, not heavy but persistent, and I didn't tell him to come in, but I didn't ask him to leave either. When I emerged from the studio hours later and sore from sitting too long on the floor, I found the kitchen already set for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just 2 plates and a small bowl of salad he must have chopped himself, because I knew the way Brian sliced cucumbers, thick and uneven, like he was always in a rush. But these were thin and deliberate and placed carefully on the edge of the plate, like someone who noticed more than he admitted. And when I glanced at the coffee mug by the sink, it was mine, and it was empty, and I knew he had cleaned it. Brian texted around 7 saying he'd be out late again, something about a post-presentation dinner with the Chicago team, and I stared at the message longer than I needed to, trying to summon the usual irritation, but it didn't come, and I set the phone down without replying, folding my hands on the countertop as Richard came in with a clean dish towel tucked over his shoulder and a glass of water already in his hand, offering it without comment like he'd seen me thirsty without needing to ask. After we finished eating, I cleared the plates and he dried them, and there was a rhythm to the motion that felt practiced but wasn't. Our bodies moving in unspoken steps around each other with a quiet ease that belonged to people who had shared years, not weeks. And when the last fork was put away and the faucet stopped dripping, I noticed the room was darker than usual. Not just dim from the overhead light, but deeper, shadowed in a way that made the corners feel farther away. And before I could check the breaker, the power flickered once, then went out entirely. There wasn't a sound except for the refrigerator, winding down and the slow stretch of old wood adjusting to the change. And I stood still in the center of the kitchen while he struck a match with a grace that didn't need practice, the flame flaring just long enough to catch on the wick of the candle near the sink, and then another, and another, until the room glowed with soft, trembling light that moved across the walls like water. And in that quiet, I realized how rare it was to feel unafraid of the dark when someone else was holding it with you. He sat down first, newspaper still folded beneath his arm, and I followed without asking why, pulling my knees up under me as the candlelight stretched across the table and the flicker cast strange versions of ourselves on the walls behind us, and we said nothing for a long time, the silence neither awkward nor forced, just full of something slow and dense like honey, and I stared at the page he wasn't reading, the way his hands rested against the wood grain, steady and relaxed, like they'd never once reached for something they weren't supposed to hold. When he finally spoke, it was without warning, the words landing in the space between us like a book being set down after the story's already over, and he said, "You remind me of who I was supposed to love." Not as a confession, not as a regret, but as a truth he had been carrying quietly. And I didn't reply, not because I didn't feel something move inside me, but because I knew that naming it would turn it into something we couldn't fold back into the dark. I stood up first this time, not abruptly, but with the kind of careful finality that closes a conversation without answering it, and I climbed the stairs with my hand grazing the banister like a tether to the floor beneath me, and I undressed in the dark, pulling the sheets up around my body like armor and lying there wide-eyed again, the ceiling nothing but a flat reminder of every feeling I had no words for. And when I finally fell asleep sometime before dawn, it was with my hand curled loosely around the place on the mattress where no one had touched me, but where I still felt the echo of warmth that didn't belong to memory. And in the morning, when our fingers met again in the space between toast and coffee, I let them rest there just long enough to admit what I still couldn't say. Brian left that Thursday evening with a rushed kiss on my temple and a half-zipped suitcase that still smelled like our hallway closet, brushing past the tension that had settled between us weeks ago like he couldn't feel it or had trained himself to ignore it, and as he backed the car out of the driveway, already on speakerphone with his project lead and gesturing out the window about traffic and timelines, I stood at the door longer than necessary, holding onto the doorknob like it could give me something solid to grip while the rest of the house stretched wider with every mile he drove away. The silence after the engine faded was instant and complete, not hollow like loneliness, but thick like velvet, coating the air in something dense and soundless, and I turned back into the hallway with bare feet and a low ache behind my ribs, knowing that for the next 2 nights it would be just Richard and me in this house. No buffers, no work schedules, no dinner conversations that veered politely into neutral territory, just hours stretched wide open across evening and morning, and the uncertain space in between. We didn't speak for the first hour, moving in separate orbits through the shared quiet, the television off, the radio untouched, just the soft thud of cupboard doors and the low hum of the refrigerator as I gathered ingredients from memory and habit, slicing onions with the precision of someone who needed her hands to stay busy so her mind wouldn't wander where it wasn't invited. And I felt him watching, not intrusively, not even directly, but in that quiet way he always had, like a heat you sense before you see the fire. When I turned to reach for the wine rack, he was already beside it, holding a bottle I hadn't noticed him take, his thumb brushing the label as he tilted it toward me with a question he didn't speak out loud, and I gave the smallest nod because it felt easier than pretending I didn't want the glass. And he opened it without ceremony, pouring 2 glasses with the kind of slow care that felt heavier than politeness. And when he handed me mine, his fingers grazed my wrist again, soft and deliberate, as if he had forgotten the last time or was trying not to remember it too clearly. And this time, instead of looking away, he held my gaze for the length of a full breath before asking quietly, "Do you want me to stop?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what I felt, but because the question itself wasn't really about touching. It was about seeing, about being seen in a way I hadn't let myself be in so long that I had started to believe I'd stopped needing it altogether. And I looked down at the floor, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to betray how much that moment was already slipping beneath my skin. Dinner was quiet, not uncomfortable, but not casual either. Every clink of the fork and shift of the chair feeling like a small declaration of presence. And after we finished, I stood to clear the plates, but he took them from my hands without a word, carrying them to the sink like it was something he'd done 100 times before. And I stayed at the table watching him rinse and scrub and dry, his movements unhurried, precise, hands steady with muscle memory that spoke of years spent caring for things most people stop noticing after a while. The way his fingers curled around the sponge, the way he turned each plate slowly under the water as if checking it for more than just leftover food, made something in me tighten, not in fear, but in hunger. The kind that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with being observed by someone who wasn't in a hurry to look away. And I stood up slowly, walking toward the sink under the pretense of folding the towel still in my hand. But really because I needed to be closer, needed to feel if the space between us was still made of caution, or if it had shifted into something else entirely. He turned just as I reached the counter, and for one suspended second, our bodies aligned so precisely that I forgot how to breathe normally. His face close enough that I could see the tiny flecks of gray in his eyes. His mouth parted slightly like he had meant to speak but changed his mind. And I held the towel tighter as if it could keep my hand still. But then he reached out slowly and placed his hand over mine. Not squeezing, not pulling, just resting it there with the weight of something real. He didn't say anything right away, and neither did I, and we stood there with the soft clatter of the faucet still dripping in the background, his hand warm against my fingers. And then he lifted it slowly and pressed it, not hard, not forceful, against his chest, right where his heartbeat lived, and I felt it under my palm, steady and unafraid, and something in me opened so fast it felt like breaking. The kiss began as a question, not with urgency or desperation, but with a quiet reverence that made my eyes close before I even realized they had, his lips brushing mine with the kind of pressure that asks instead of assumes, and I answered without words. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I had nothing left in me that wanted to resist. And the moment I kissed him back, Everything that had been held in silence between us broke like a dam and flooded the room. It wasn't clumsy or wild or desperate. It was slow and aching and patient, the kind of kiss that doesn't come from impulse but from the long absence of touch, from the need to be acknowledged, to be felt, to be remembered by someone who sees you not as who you should be, but as who you are in the quiet moments when no one is looking. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a role or a responsibility or a wife or a woman keeping the house in order. I felt like a person with a mouth that still wanted and hands that still burned and a body that still knew how to lean into heat without apology. And then he stepped back first, breathing uneven but gaze steady, and said, "You're not supposed to kiss me back like that." And I looked at him with everything I hadn't said burning in my throat and replied, "You're not supposed to see me." And neither of us said another word. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment, because the air in our bedroom had shifted into something too thick to inhale and too charged to ignore. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face just inches from mine, not in the act of kissing, but in the moments right before it. That breathless stretch of time where two people teeter on the edge of something irreversible and still somehow believe they have a choice. And I lay there in the dark with the sheets pulled up to my chin like I was trying to shield myself from the very thing I had already invited in. The ceiling became a canvas for every thought I couldn't shut off, and I counted the lines in the molding and the turns of the ceiling fan and the seconds between each shift of my legs under the blanket, and the house stayed quiet except for the occasional creak of wood or the distant hum of the fridge, but I could feel him in the other room, not in a haunted way but in a present one, like his breath had settled into the spaces between the walls, and his heartbeat still echoed in my palm even though we hadn't touched since. I didn't cry, because there was nothing to grieve, and I didn't panic, because the fear had already passed, and what settled in its place was something heavier and stranger and undeniably true. It had not been an accident. It had not been confusion. It had not been loneliness twisted into something it wasn't. It had been need, pure and clear and unflinching. The kind of need that doesn't ask permission because it already lives under the skin. By the time the sun began to shift shadows across the windowsill, I had memorized every breath I'd taken in that bed, every twist of the sheet and every shallow exhale, and I listened for his steps downstairs, not because I was waiting for him, but because I knew I would hear them, because even when he moved, quietly there was a weight to his presence that the house could no longer pretend wasn't there. When I walked into the kitchen, barefoot and exhausted, still in the long gray shirt I had worn to bed, I noticed the light had changed. Not brighter or warmer, but different, like the air itself had been stirred, and I looked toward the counter out of habit, toward the place where Brian usually left his coffee cup, the exact spot next to the fruit bowl that always held his half-finished mug with the chipped rim and faint stain around the lip, and there it was, a cup already poured, the same pale ceramic, the same careful placement, only it wasn't Brian's, and I knew it before I picked it up. It was Richard's, and it had been left exactly where Brian always left his. Like muscle memory had replaced intention, like the house itself had adjusted without telling us, and I stood there for a long moment just looking at it, the steam still curling from the surface, as if it had all happened quietly while the world slept, and now it was just waiting for me to admit it. He came in a moment later, shirt sleeves rolled up and hair still damp from a quick shower, his eyes flickering toward mine like he wasn't sure which version of me he would find, and I didn't speak. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I was afraid the wrong ones would slip out first, the kind that try to rewind something that can't be undone. And I watched him move to the fridge and pull out the milk with a calm that felt rehearsed, like he had already decided we wouldn't talk about it unless I did. I sat down at the table because I needed something solid beneath me, something to hold my weight that wasn't a feeling or a glance, and I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and stared into the dark surface as if it could show me a reflection that made sense. And when he walked past to grab a spoon from the drawer, his arm brushed mine, not intentionally but not entirely by accident either, and this time neither of us moved away. There was a rhythm to the morning that felt too normal, and that made it worse, because pretending nothing had changed felt more dangerous than acknowledging it. And when he finally sat down across from me with his own cup, he looked at me without expectation, just presence, and I realized in that moment that there would be no confession, no apology, no explanation, just the echo of what we had already allowed to happen and the choice of whether to breathe around it or let it grow. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, what he thought this meant, what part of him had allowed that kiss to exist between us. But I didn't because I already knew the answers wouldn't satisfy the part of me that had kissed him back, the part that still ached from the way he had pulled away first, like he knew the danger better than I did, like he had survived that fire once before and didn't plan on stepping into it again. Instead, we drank our coffee in silence, the kind that wasn't peaceful but wasn't tense either, just full of things neither of us could name yet, and when I finally stood up to clear the mugs, I noticed he had left his in the exact same spot Brian used to place his every morning before leaving for work, and in that detail, that small, unintentional mimicry, I saw something that chilled me more than guilt or shame or fear. I saw permanence, the quiet kind that takes root before anyone admits it's there. And as I rinsed the cup and placed it in the drying rack beside mine, I realized that the question wasn't whether it had meant something. The question was how long I would pretend it didn't. The storm had been creeping in since morning, that slow buildup of pressure that thickens the air and makes the windows look darker even when the lamps are still off. And by early evening, the clouds had gathered in full force, stretching low and dense across the sky like a ceiling trying to press down on the roof. And I had shut myself in the study because the weight of that sky felt easier to carry when I could put a desk between me and the rest of the house, letting the soft hum of rain against the glass become the only sound louder than the silence between me and my own thoughts. I was sorting through negatives I hadn't dared to print, film strips coiled like old secrets in shallow trays, and the shadows in the room moved with every flicker of lightning outside, painting brief silver streaks across the wall that disappeared before I could follow them, and I had just set one of the frames against the window to check exposure when I heard his voice behind me, low and direct and closer than expected, saying, "The basement's flooding, I need a hand." And before I could answer, he had already stepped into the room, with sleeves rolled and eyes serious, the kind of serious that came not from panic, but from having seen worse and knowing how to move through it. I followed him down the narrow staircase, bare feet on cold wood, the smell of old stone and wet dust growing stronger with each step, and the further we descended, the more the house above us felt like something distant and irrelevant, the sound of thunder muffled into a deep pulse that vibrated through the walls, and when we reached the base of the stairs, I saw the shallow pool spreading across the floor, thin water reflecting the weak yellow light from the single bulb swinging slightly above us. He handed me a plastic bucket already scratched from years of use, and I crouched beside the far wall where the leak had started, feeling the cold water soak through the knees of my jeans as I scooped and poured with a rhythm that felt both exhausting and hypnotic. And every time I looked up, he was there beside me, not speaking, just moving with quiet efficiency, his shirt damp from the humidity, his hands steady as they emptied and lifted and steadied again. The space between us narrowed each time we crossed paths in that small room, our bodies brushing in the dim light, the backs of our hands grazing, our arms colliding gently when we both reached for the same pail, and there was a heat to it that had nothing to do with the temperature, just the weight of proximity, the kind that builds over time until it feels like contact even before anyone touches anything. I shifted slightly to reach a heavy container pushed behind the old shelves, and my foot slipped on the slick concrete, not enough to fall fully, but enough to tilt my balance sharply. And before I could catch myself, his arms were around me, one hand gripping my waist and the other braced against the wall behind me, and the moment held too long, stretched past the point of recovery into something more deliberate, and I stayed there in his arms not because I was frozen or shocked, but because I didn't want to move, didn't want to pull away from the place where everything felt quieter, except for his breath against my neck and the press of his fingers against the curve of my side. We didn't speak at first, just stared at each other in that heavy air with only inches between us, his hand still resting where it had landed, his eyes darker than usual, not from light but from the storm inside both of us that had been building longer than either of us would admit. And finally I said, not as a warning but as a confession, "We can't keep doing this." And he didn't flinch or look away. He just whispered, "But you want to." And I paused longer than I should have before answering. "I do." The words didn't echo, didn't fall like betrayal. They just settled between us like permission. And he leaned in first this time, slowly and deliberately, like he wanted to be sure I wouldn't step back. And I didn't. I tilted my head toward him with breath held and heart racing and lips parted not out of habit but out of hunger. And when his mouth met mine again, it wasn't like the first time. It was deeper and more open, filled with the kind of need that doesn't ask or negotiate, the kind that finds the center of your spine and pulls everything into it with a force that feels like drowning and breathing at the same time. We kissed in the half-dark of that basement with water lapping against our ankles and thunder shaking the pipes above us, and his hands were careful but urgent, tracing the length of my back like he was relearning something familiar that he'd forgotten too long ago. And I clung to him with a desperation that didn't feel like loss or guilt, just truth, pure and physical and alive in a way I hadn't felt since before I forgot how to ask for what I wanted. When we finally broke apart, it wasn't because the storm outside demanded it or the house above us stirred. It was because we both needed air, needed space to hold what we had just created in that flash of chaos and contact, and I leaned against his chest with his arms still around me, my head tucked beneath his chin, the scent of old rain and soap clinging to the collar of his shirt, and I closed my eyes not to escape, but to remember it better. The way our breath moved in unison, the way the water around us kept rising, the way neither of us said a word. I stayed in his arms longer than I meant to, not because I was afraid of moving, but because something in the stillness felt more honest than anything I had spoken in weeks, and his hands didn't roam or tighten, but stayed steady against my back. The way someone holds a memory they know is fleeting, and the sound of the rain above us grew louder as if the house wanted to bury this moment before it could live past the next breath. But I didn't pull away until the cold began to reach through my soaked jeans and remind me that the world above the basement still existed. We didn't speak as we emptied the buckets one last time and left them stacked beside the dryer. Didn't make eye contact as we climbed the stairs with heavy steps and heavier lungs, and when we reached the kitchen, he peeled his damp shirt off without a word and handed me a towel for my hair, as if that could absorb more than just water. As if pressing terry cloth to my scalp could erase what we had let happen in the dim light beneath the house. But my fingers shook slightly as I dried myself, and I knew that some parts of me were going to stay soaked no matter what I used. He disappeared down the hallway, presumably to change, and I stood barefoot in the hallway still holding the towel, not sure whether I wanted to be alone or wanted him to return, and the storm outside thrashed harder against the windows like it was trying to remind me that we weren't invisible, that there were still consequences waiting just beyond the edge of this night. But I didn't care, not in that moment, not when my skin still burned where he had touched me, and my lips still carried the pressure of his mouth pressed into mine like a promise I didn't know I needed until it was already given. I drifted into the bathroom and peeled off the damp shirt that clung to my ribs like regret, tossing it into the hamper like it was someone else's decision, and I stood in the dim light with the towel wrapped around my shoulders, staring at the reflection in the foggy mirror that didn't quite look like me anymore, not because I looked different, but because I could finally see myself clearly, and that was somehow more disorienting than not recognizing my own face. I stepped into the hallway again. I heard movement at the front of the house, keys clinking against the side table, and the distinct sound of the front door creaking open, then shutting again too fast to be casual. And for a moment I thought maybe I was imagining it, that the storm had warped my sense of time and space and presence. But then I heard his voice, Brian's voice, unmistakable and tired and too early, and the realization hit with the weight of a falling beam, sudden and irreversible and somehow completely expected, because of course he would come back a day ahead of schedule. Of course he would walk in, while my hair still dripped with water that wasn't from a shower and my breath still tasted like someone else's kiss. Panic didn't surge through me like fire. It crept in like cold, quiet, and numbing, making my limbs move faster than my thoughts, and I grabbed the towel from my shoulders and rushed toward the bathroom just as Brian's footsteps reached the hallway, ducking into the doorway and closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than a scream, leaning against it with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might rattle the frame, and I closed my eyes as if darkness could make me invisible, as if holding still would turn me into something too small to notice. I could hear him pause outside, the shifting of weight and the brief hesitation of someone trying to decide whether to knock or speak. And then the footsteps moved on, toward the kitchen or maybe the stairs. I couldn't tell because my pulse was too loud and the house had become unfamiliar, like someone had rearranged the walls while we weren't paying attention, and I stayed in that bathroom longer than I needed to, breathing in the scent of mildew and shampoo and fear, trying to steady myself into something neutral. When I finally emerged, the hallway was empty, the towel wrapped tight around me like a shield, and I walked slowly toward the kitchen with my feet silent on the floor, trying to make each step feel normal even though nothing inside me felt normal anymore. And when I turned the corner, I saw Brian at the sink, pouring a glass of water like it was any other night, his suitcase still zipped near the door, his shoulders relaxed in a way that made me want to collapse. He didn't look at me at first, just sipped the water and set the glass down with a quiet clink, and then he turned, his eyes landing on the towel around my shoulders, his gaze lingering for a second too long before sliding away like he had made a mental note but wasn't ready to ask about it yet. And all he said was, "It's really coming down out there." And I nodded, gripping the edge of the counter to keep from falling into whatever that meant. He didn't ask why my hair was wet, or why there were faint lines of dirt on the side of my calf, or why I was wrapped in the towel instead of already in pajamas. And I realized then that sometimes the most dangerous questions are the ones no one wants answered, because they already know the shape of the truth and are just waiting to decide when to admit they've seen it. I nodded again and walked past him, up the stairs to our bedroom, where the sheets still smelled like sleep, and the clock blinked 10:42, and the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded, and as I pulled the blanket over my body and stared at the ceiling once more, I felt the storm outside begin to soften, but the one inside me only grow louder. The kitchen was so quiet that even the refrigerator hum seemed hesitant, like it didn't want to interrupt what none of us were saying, and the morning light coming through the blinds only made the silence brighter, sharper, like it was trying to expose something that still lived in shadow. And I sat at the table, with my hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, nodding occasionally at the sound of Brian's voice while every muscle in my back worked overtime to remain still. He was standing by the counter holding his tablet like a shield, scrolling through something with the kind of distracted intensity that told me he was talking mostly to himself, offering half-formed updates about a potential investor out of Austin, a follow-up from the Montreal team, and a breakfast meeting scheduled with someone named Reed, who apparently couldn't read a contract but knew how to pressure a team into panic signing. And I responded with small gestures, a slight tilt of my head, a drawn-out because anything more would have cracked the surface I was barely holding together. Richard sat diagonally across from me, a little farther back from the table than necessary, hands resting lightly on his thighs, not touching his coffee, not looking at Brian, not looking at me either, but not looking away from me either, and the air between us was thick enough to chew through. So heavy it felt like a fourth person in the room just waiting to speak first, and when my eyes caught his for a split second too long, I smiled, too wide, too practiced, too aware, and I knew instantly I had overcompensated because Brian stopped. Talking mid-sentence, turned his head slowly, and stared at me like he had just caught the echo of something that wasn't meant for him. He didn't say anything then, just tapped the tablet screen with a little more force than necessary, and announced that he was heading to the garage to call Reed back, said he needed quiet because the echo in the kitchen messed with his Bluetooth, and I nodded too quickly, too relieved, too obviously grateful for an exit I didn't have to take myself. And as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, the air shifted again. Not lighter, not calmer, just differently strained. Like the eye of a storm had wandered directly into our kitchen and was giving us one last moment to decide which way the wind would turn. I stood up without thinking, walked over to the sink to rinse my cup even though I hadn't drunk from it, and I felt Richard behind me before I heard him move, his footsteps soft but intentional. And when he placed his hand lightly on the side of my neck, just below my ear where the skin is too thin to lie, I didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even breathe at first. And for one long suspended second, I let myself lean into the warmth of his fingers like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then the voice came, not a shout but worse, a quiet disbelief layered in venom that made every hair on my arms rise at once, and Brian said from behind us, "You touching my wife now, Dad?" And I froze, body locking into place like a hunted animal caught mid-step, and I couldn't turn around because my vision had narrowed to the reflection in the faucet, where I could see just enough of Brian's face to know that he wasn't confused, wasn't questioning, wasn't gathering. Data he already knew. Richard didn't speak at first, just straightened slowly and dropped his hand like it had been burned, and the sound of his breath behind me changed, no longer calm but measured in self-control. And I turned around finally, pressing the edge of the sink behind me with both hands to keep from collapsing, and Brian stepped forward with that slow, deliberate pace he used when something inside him was breaking and he hadn't decided yet what kind of pieces he wanted to throw. "Wow," he said, almost laughing, almost choking. "This is what helping us grieve looks like?" And his voice cracked at the word grieve, like it had turned sour in his mouth, and I tried to open my lips to say something that might explain or soften or rewind, but no words came, only the memory of Richard's heartbeat beneath my fingers and the echo of my own breath in the basement. Richard stepped in then, not closer to Brian, but into the space between us like a barrier he knew couldn't hold, and his voice was low but clear, that steady tone he always used when trying to diffuse something already lit, and he said, "It was never planned. It was never meant to happen. It was one moment, one kiss, and it changed something we didn't know needed changing." And the second those words left his mouth, Brian's face twisted, not in anger but in betrayal, the kind that turns blood cold and makes silence louder than any scream. "One kiss?" Brian repeated, stepping closer now, fists clenched not in preparation for violence but in sheer disbelief. "That's what you're going with? One kiss like it just slipped out in passing?" And then he turned to me, his voice breaking fully now, louder and raw. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been playing house with him while I worked overtime to keep this place together?" I shook my head too fast, too hard, unable to speak but desperate to show him that I hadn't meant to become this version of myself, that the house he built was already tilting before I ever let someone else steady it. But none of that made it to my mouth because Richard stepped in again, his voice heavier this time, slower, more final, and he said, "One kiss? Once." But it meant everything. And that sentence hung in the air like a dropped match, small and quiet, but deadly. Brian didn't yell after that, didn't throw anything or slam his hand against the wall like I thought he might. He just stared at us both like we were strangers breaking into his home, and when he finally moved, it was toward the side table where his keys sat waiting, and he grabbed them with a sharp jingle that echoed like gunfire, walked out without another word, and slammed the door behind him with a force that shook the cabinet glass. The sound of the door slamming didn't fade the way a door normally does. It stayed suspended in the air like it had been carved into the drywall and laid flat across the floor, echoing in places that didn't usually hold sound, and I stood there with my palms still pressed against the cold edge of the sink, my spine too rigid to straighten, my knees locked as though releasing them would make me collapse. And behind me, Richard hadn't moved either, like he was waiting for someone to tell him how much damage had actually been done. For several long seconds, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the wall clock above the pantry, each second louder than the last, cruel in its rhythm, mocking in its normalcy, like it had no business continuing when the rest of the morning had shattered into something unrecognizable. And when I finally turned around to face him, I saw in Richard's eyes not shame or guilt, but something far heavier. Regret, not for what we had done, but for how undeniable it had become. For how impossible it was now to pretend the line hadn't been crossed. I didn't ask him what he was thinking because I already knew, the same way you know when a storm is too far gone to reverse course. And instead I walked slowly to the middle of the room, arms crossed tight across my chest like I was trying to hold in whatever part of me still ached for the version of life we had destroyed. And I stood there for a full minute without speaking, feeling the weight of my own choices press against the inside of my ribs like they were trying to burst, free and scream. And when I finally met his eyes again, I saw him looking at the door Brian had just walked through, like maybe if he stared long enough, it would open again and reverse the last 10 minutes. He didn't speak until I did. And even then, my voice was thin and flat, the kind of voice people use when they're afraid of waking something already broken. And I said, "He knows it wasn't nothing." And Richard nodded slowly, his jaw tight, his shoulders too stiff to look like comfort. And he replied, "Because it wasn't." And that was all either of us said for a long while, because what else was there left to name when the damage had already been done with our silence? I sank into the nearest chair like it might anchor me, elbows on the table, hands pressed to my face, trying to decide whether I felt more humiliated or more free. And Richard stayed standing, pacing slowly from the refrigerator to the edge of the counter, not looking at me anymore, his eyes fixed on the middle distance like he was replaying every word he should have said differently. And then I heard the slow exhale he let out, the kind of breath people take when they've finally accepted what they can't take back. For hours after Brian left, the house was wrapped in that kind of heavy stillness that doesn't invite conversation, and I moved from room to room like someone forgetting what each space had once meant. Walking past the framed photos and the half-folded blankets and the mugs still drying in the rack, all of it normal, all of it untouched. And yet none of it looked the same, because now every object in the house was sitting in a new shadow, one shaped not by what we had done in secret but by the way it had been seen. By the time afternoon reached the window panes and the light changed from yellow to blue, I found myself standing in the hallway by the front door, hand hovering near the knob even though I had nowhere to go, because every inch of the house felt claustrophobic and vast at the same time, and when I finally walked away from it, I went upstairs and lay across the bed without pulling the covers back, staring at the ceiling with dry eyes that refused to cry, not out of strength, but because the ache had spread past tears into something dull and vast and permanent. Richard didn't come upstairs until after dusk, and I didn't hear his footsteps until he was just outside the bedroom, standing there like someone waiting to be let in or told to leave. And he didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood quietly for a long time before retreating down the hallway. Again, and in that moment, I realized we had both lost the same thing, but in completely different ways. He had lost the right to be here, and I had lost the illusion that I ever fully belonged. It was well after 10 when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the vibration loud against the wood in the silence of the room, and I picked it up with fingers that already knew the message. Would hurt before I even read it, and when I opened it, there were only 2 short lines on the screen, sent without punctuation, but each word felt sharp enough to cut. Let him pack his things. You're not my wife anymore. He's not my father either. I didn't drop the phone or gasp or clutch my chest the way people do in movies. I just sat there staring at the message while the screen slowly dimmed and the words burned themselves into the inside of my eyelids. And when the light finally vanished and left me in the dark again, I knew that nothing after this would be soft. I walked downstairs barefoot, the steps cold beneath me, the rooms darker than they had been, and I found Richard in the living room, sitting in the armchair by the window, still wearing the same shirt. From that morning, like he hadn't figured out how to change yet, and I didn't speak as I handed him the phone, just stood there while he read the message. And when he finally looked up at me, I saw in his face the echo of something I recognized too well, a kind of mourning that had no funeral, And I knew that everything had changed, not when we kissed and not when Brian saw, but now, in the quiet aftermath, in the space where belonging had turned to exile and love had turned to ruin. The silence after both of them left didn't settle like fog or hang like mist. It dropped like a sheet of thick fabric across the house, muting everything into a slow suffocation that pressed into my chest no matter which room I entered. And it had been 7 days since Brian's message, and 5 since Richard carried his duffel bag to the car without looking back. But the absence of them both didn't feel like loss. It felt like a rearrangement of gravity, one I hadn't agreed to, one that made the floor tilt no matter where I placed my feet. I had expected pain or guilt or something red and sharp, but what I got instead was a dull vacancy that clung to the walls like humidity after rain, and the house, once filled with subtle tensions and undercurrents, had flattened into a single note that never changed pitch. The kind of emptiness that made even the refrigerator motor sound like a chorus. The kind of quiet that turned the creaking floorboard outside the laundry room into a scream. I tried to return to work like a person pretending to still be a person, setting up the softbox in the guest bedroom where the light hit just right, charging batteries that didn't need charging, cleaning lenses that weren't dirty, doing everything except pressing the shutter, because every time I lifted the camera to my eye, my hands would tremble slightly, and my heart would race for no good reason, and the frame I wanted to compose would blur, not because of the settings, but because I couldn't find a single subject I trusted myself to see clearly. Even when I forced myself to photograph something, dried flowers on the windowsill, the chipped paint on the back porch, a forgotten pair of shoes near the coat rack, the images looked lifeless before they were even captured, and the weight of the camera no longer felt like power or control or expression. It felt like obligation. And that terrified me more than anything because it meant the thing that had always grounded me had started to float too. I was digging through the second drawer of the hallway cabinet, searching for old batteries or maybe just distraction, when I found the photo wedged between 2 old receipts and a faded takeout menu from the Vietnamese place Brian used to swear was the best in the city. And it took me a moment to realize what I was holding because the image felt both familiar and foreign. A glossy 4:06 snapshot of a late summer afternoon, the 3 of us sitting on a picnic blanket under the oak trees at Franklin Park, the light soft and golden, the kind of light you don't notice when it's real because it only becomes beautiful when you remember it. In the photo, I was laughing with my head tilted back, Brian had his arm looped lazily around my waist, and Richard sat just beside us holding a half-eaten apple, looking at something off-camera with that half-smile he wore when he was pretending not to be deeply interested, and I stared at the picture for longer than I meant to, tracing the edge of the paper with my thumb, feeling my breath tighten in a way that felt like grief but landed more like confusion. I tore the photograph down the middle with the kind of precision that didn't come from anger, but from the need to separate one thing from another, the tear slicing diagonally through the image until Richard's face detached from the rest, landing on the floor like it had been waiting to leave the frame all along. And I stared at the 2 halves, one whole, one broken, before kneeling down and taping them back together in the quietest act of contradiction I've ever done, letting his face remain on the floor where I left it, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, because I couldn't pretend anymore that all of us had belonged in the same picture. Later that day, I stepped outside for the first time in 2 days, the sun too bright for what I felt, and the wind too soft to carry any kind of clarity. And as I checked the mailbox that I hadn't opened since the week before, I heard a voice from the sidewalk, soft and familiar, and edged with cautious friendliness, and when I looked up, it was Mrs. Dunning from next door, her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes shaded by oversized sunglasses she wore year-round like a habit, and she asked, "Your father-in-law doing all right?" In the kind of tone that wasn't nosy, but just enough to remind me that people had been watching more than I realized. I held her gaze for a beat too long before replying, "He's not my anything anymore," and the words came out flatter than I intended but truer than I expected, and she gave me that polite smile people offer when they don't want to press and just kept walking, leaving me there in the driveway with a handful of grocery flyers, and a feeling in my chest that wasn't quite pain, but something colder and less poetic. When I came back inside, I didn't go to the kitchen or the bedroom or even the hallway, where the photo still sat half-assembled. I walked straight to the studio, the place that used to feel like sanctuary and had now turned into a room filled with echoes. And I stood in the doorway staring at the shelf near the far wall where his coffee mug still sat, untouched since the last morning he drank from it, placed deliberately in the same spot Brian had always used, and I reached for it with a hand that didn't tremble this time. I turned it in my palm slowly, feeling the weight of ceramic and memory pressed into my skin, and I stared at the rim where his mouth had rested, and I tried to feel something sharp or clear or useful, but all I felt was tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from too much remembering, and without thinking. Without giving myself time to second-guess it, I pulled my arm back and hurled the mug against the floor. It shattered in an instant. A clean echo followed by the scatter of fragments across the wood, and the sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to say something in a house where no one else was listening. Enough to declare an end, even if I couldn't name exactly what was over. I didn't flinch when the mug broke because I needed it to break. Needed to hear something snap outside my own body, something real and physical and final. And for a long time, I just stood there in the studio doorway, watching the pieces roll to a stop like tiny ghosts, sharp and useless and beautiful in the way broken things always are when they've held too much meaning for too long. And part of me wanted to kneel down and pick them up, maybe even sweep them into my hand the way I used to gather negatives that had slipped from the string. But another part of me knew that if I touched those shards, I'd bleed, not from the ceramic, but from the memory. And I wasn't ready to bleed for either of them anymore. I turned off the light without cleaning the mess because I wanted it to stay there for a while. Wanted the shards to remind me that something had ended and that I was the one who ended it. Not Brian, not Richard, not time or fate or grief, but me, with one choice and one need and one kiss that led us into a room we had no right entering, but couldn't walk away from once we were inside. And now the cup was gone and the kitchen was empty, and the house, once heavy with presents, had become a gallery of what was missing. That night, I didn't cook dinner and I didn't reheat leftovers. I didn't answer messages or return missed calls or even check if there were any at all. I sat in the living room with the lights off and my legs curled beneath me, facing the window that looked out over the yard where the grass had grown uneven, since Brian stopped trimming it, and where the swing Richard had fixed in April still hung, motionless in the dark, like it was waiting for a child who no longer visited or maybe had never been born. The clock ticked without rhythm, and the shadows moved across the walls in slow, disjointed shapes. And I thought about how strange it was that a house can hold so many versions of you at once. The woman who smiled through dinner for the sake of peace. The woman who stayed quiet when she should have screamed. The woman who let herself be seen by someone she wasn't supposed to let close. And the woman who watched it all collapse and still didn't feel like she belonged to any of them. I don't know how long I sat there before my mind wandered back to his voice. Not from the moment in the basement or the kitchen or the porch, but from that early morning weeks ago, when he helped me with the film canister and looked at my hands with something like reverence. And I remember the way he spoke the words like he had carried them for years. You still feel everything, and how at the time I didn't answer because I didn't know if I still did, or if I just remembered what feeling used to be. Now, sitting in the quiet wreckage of what we'd made and unmade, I whispered the words into the room like they were a secret I had to test before I believed it myself, and I said I do. And I hate it. Not because I wished to stop feeling, but because I wished I didn't feel it all at once. Grief, shame, clarity, resentment, longing, hunger, release, folded together in a single unbearable knot that no one else could see. But that had been pulling at me from the inside for years. The house stayed still, but my mind didn't, and I knew sleep wasn't coming. Not tonight. Not with the weight of a week like this one pressing on every nerve. And I walked slowly through the darkened hallways, not turning on any lights, just feeling the walls with my palms like I was trying to memorize their texture one last time. And each room I passed reminded me not of what had happened there, but who I had been when it did. And the hardest part was realizing that version of me didn't exist anymore. Upstairs, the bedroom was untouched, sheets pulled tight, pillows fluffed from the morning before, as if Brian might walk in again and say it had all been a test, and I had failed and he would take back the house and the message and the silence, but the room didn't belong to either of us anymore. And I sat on the edge of the bed for only a moment before walking past it, into the corner hallway where the old cedar closet held the boxes we never unpacked. The ones with holiday cards and unused frames and a sweater I once wore when we drove through Vermont, and he called me his anchor. I pulled open the top drawer of the dresser beside it and found nothing inside but dust and 2 AA batteries, one leaking at the edge, and it hit me then. How empty things can feel full until you actually look inside them, and I wondered if that had been true of me all along. Back downstairs, the studio was dark, and the shards of the cup still glinted on the floor like the punctuation to a sentence I hadn't yet spoken, and I didn't clean them, didn't move them, just stepped over them as I sat back in the same chair, legs folded up, arms wrapped tight around my middle like I could still hold myself together if I used enough pressure. And in the dark, I repeated the sentence again. Not because I was unsure, but because it had become the only thing left that still felt honest. And I whispered, he saw me, letting the words stretch in the air until they wrapped around my ribs. But not for who I was. And I paused, breathing slow, for who I used to be. And then I said the one thing that I knew was true, and couldn't be undone, the thing that settled like ash in my mouth and stayed long after the words were gone. And now, I don't know who that even is.